Beto struggles in Texas as Brady pours money into 2 House races. Plus, a conversation with Josh Kraushaar on what to look for in the midterms. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
I made the devil run. I gave him poison just for fun.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and check out our membership options today if you want to get access to hundreds of exclusive pieces of analysis and reporting that you can't find anywhere else. You can also sign up for our free newsletter that goes out every Friday that keeps you up to date on the latest in gun news around the country. Just one email, very simple. Not going to flood your inbox, and you'll be well informed of what's happening. So this week, we're going to look ahead at the election. We've got the election coming up here. This will go live for members on Sunday and then everyone else on Monday. So the election will be Tuesday. And I wanted to bring in somebody who has a great broad view of the political situation, who can give us some great insight into what we should be watching for the election to tell how guns have impacted everything. And that's Axios' own Josh Kraushaar. Welcome to the show, Josh. How are you doing today?
Stephen, thanks for having me on the show. Real pleasure. I've been a follower of yours for quite some time, and it's good to talk elections. Just a few days left till the big day.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you recently moved over to Axios not that long ago. Could you tell people just a little bit about what you do over there?
Yeah, so I'm the senior political correspondent, cover campaigns and elections, which is the job I've had since starting my career, basically. But one of the products I put out is a Sunday afternoon newsletter called Sunday Sneak, and it covers all the big trends, developments, breaking news, analysis across the world of politics and elections. So we have regular Sneak, which is a must-read kind of news rundown of what's going on in Washington. But the Sunday version is the one I put together, and it focuses on campaigns and elections. And we got one more issue, and then we're gonna head right into the midterms.
Yep. And so you are the perfect person to help us navigate through what people should be looking for in terms of how guns perform in the midterm elections here in 2022. So, off the bat, I think for me, the first thing, I did a piece over at the Reload analysis piece that sort of went through my thoughts on this. I think that there's 2 ballot initiatives, one in Iowa and Oregon. And the ballot initiatives are great because it's just, you'll get to see what the voters want on the specific question. There's no sort of need to really deeply interpret what goes on there. But that's one to watch. Then you have, there's a number of gubernatorial elections as well. That I think are going to be really good parallels for gun policy because they're at the center of these races. You've got the Texas race, the Georgia race, and now the sort of a surprise one, the New York race has become very close. Let's start with Texas, though. You got Beto O'Rourke is running against Greg Abbott, and he's been, staunchly pro-gun control to the point where he is literally wants to take people's AR-15s and AK-47s. He doesn't think the public should be able to own those. And then on the other side, you have Greg Abbott, the Republican, who just signed, permitless gun carry into law there. He's expanded gun rights in the state, gun rights protections, loosened the gun laws. So it's a pretty stark matchup, right? And Beto has made this a top campaign issue, especially in the aftermath of the Uvalde elementary school shooting. But he doesn't seem to have made very much progress. The latest polling has him down 13 points, I think. And so what do you make of that race?
Yeah, so I want to take one step back, and then we'll go a little bit of a deep dive in Texas when it comes to gun politics. It used to be, when I started covering politics, that there were pro-gun Democrats, there were NRA-endorsed Democrats, and there were Republicans that voted for, the Brady bill back in the 90s and voted for gun control if they represented suburban states or suburban districts. So you really would have to watch like a lot of these individual races and really closely follow where the candidates are when it comes to gun policy, because there was a lot of diversity on gun policy within both parties' coalitions. That's not the case anymore. And I think a good rule of thumb, not just for this election, but in recent elections going forward as well, if Republicans have a good night, it's a good night for gun policy, gun owners' conservative views on less gun restrictions, less gun regulations. A good night for the NRA, a good night for gun rights groups. And we're looking at the very strong likelihood at this point that this is going to be a very good Republican night, where Texas, which is a Republican state, that governor's race is probably not going to be close. Governor Abbott is going to, if the polls are accurate and if the reporting I've done in that race is correct, it's going to be a pretty easy night for the Republican governor. And you're right. I mean, one of the issues with Beto O'Rourke is that he thought he was sort of capitalizing on the shifting winds within the new Democratic Party in Texas, where he ran against Ted Cruz and came closer than a lot of people expected. But the reality is Texas still has a very sizable gun-owning population, a very solid rural base of voters in the state. And there are other trends in Texas that have nothing to do with guns, like the Hispanic voters along the Rio Grande border that are becoming Republicans, and they used to be pretty solid Democrats. So, the issue of gun policy is not one that's a winning one for Democrats, and not one that's a winning issue for Beto. Beto has not gotten any traction since, even after the awful Uvalde shooting, where he had this moment, confronting Governor Abbott at that press conference. That did not get him additional support, and if anything, it may have cost him a little bit. And just playing to, if you're in Texas, if you're just playing to the suburban base, the urban base of the Democratic Party, if you're kind of catering to the voters that are most concerned about restricting gun access, that's not enough to get a majority in Texas. And the way the winds are blowing overall, you're looking at a pretty sizable Republican success story in Texas this year.
Yeah. Do you think that's the same? I mean, Texas seems like an easy one because you expect the Republican to do well. Now, Beto O'Rourke is supposed, as you just mentioned, is supposed to be like a new, invigoration for the Texas Democrats, but that's been the storyline for several elections now, and he hasn't actually pulled any of them off. But I don't think the same is really true in Georgia, right? You have a much more purple, voting bloc there these days. What do you make of that race?
Yeah, so Georgia's a more competitive state writ large, and obviously Democrats won those 2 Senate seats that got a whole lot of attention just about 2 years ago. But Georgia also has a very conservative rural base that still gets any Republican to 44 or 45%, if not more, even in a bad year for the party. So, and those are gun owning conservatives, a little writ large. If you're looking at folks who own guns, all you have to do is look at some of those rural precincts across the state and suburban area. And it's not just the rural, but those are voters who will vote on the issue of gun control. It'll be a litmus test issue, and they're showing up and they're motivated. And then in the governor's race, you have a governor who first won election by running a campaign ad touting how committed to protecting gun rights he would be, and he won. Yeah,
and to permitless carry. Which he did end up signing.
That's right, and he passed legislation that gun owners cheered for. And then you have an opponent in Stacey Abrams who certainly toes the liberal or conventional Democratic Party line on gun control and gun regulations.
And she's attacked him for the permitless carry. Yeah. Yeah.
So I mean, you're in a Republican year at a time when the winds are at the Republican Party's back. It's tough to be someone who's to the left on that issue, and it's tough to see. It's still tough to see if a Democrat is sounding too liberal on gun policy, how they can win a state like Georgia, how they can win a state like Texas. It did happen in the Senate race in 2021 in those runoffs, but it took a confluence of factors for that to happen.
Yeah, but that's still a play here in this election too, right? I mean. Walker's running well behind Kemp, and Warnock's running well ahead of Abrams, right? Do you think that's just an incumbency advantage, or do you think there's some difference? I mean, Warnock supports, the assault weapons ban in Congress. They seem to have pretty similar stances as far as gun control goes. But Abrams is not making up the same kind of ground on Kemp as, Walker is making on Warnock.
Right. There are other factors other than gun policy that are determining why Abrams is doing so poorly and Warnock is still hanging around neck and neck with Herschel Walker. Some of it is, Abrams denying or having trouble accepting the results of the 2018 election, which has really created this sort of baggage and an inability to kind of expand her coalition. You have her views on abortion rights that are well to the left of, perhaps even Senator Warnock, even though they're both pro-choice, of course. But Stacey Abrams went on Morning Joe and said that abortion was essentially an economic issue and has used sort of much more progressive rhetoric in talking about protecting abortion rights. Warnock is a much more dynamic campaigner. He's more charismatic, I would argue, in that Senate race. He has ties to, he's the pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church, so that gives him a certain base that Abrams has not been able to match this year. So yeah, on guns, you're seeing both Democrats taking the gun control line and Republicans taking the typical conservative line, but that hasn't been a major factor, at least in the campaign advertising and the messaging in those contests.
I don't think so.
No, it's baked in. It's baked in. These are not. If you watch the ads, Governor Kemp ran an ad talking about how he would protect gun rights that got a lot of attention in 2018. It was mocked by the left and cheered by his supporters. But we haven't seen. There've been other issues that have taken over in both the governor's race and certainly the Senate race.
Yeah, certainly there are other issues at top of mind for most voters in most of these races. I do feel like Georgia's governor race, it's a little higher profile than in a lot of other elections, including even the Senate election there. Just for one, because that is one of Kemp's biggest accomplishments as far as legislation goes in that race. It's a little bit. It just seems a little more prominent in the Georgia governor's election than even in the Senate, even though the positions of the candidates are
you're passing gun laws as governor. Like a governor has more control of a state, obviously state policy. Right. But in terms of the ads, in terms of the messaging you're seeing on the airwaves, hasn't been as at least based on the data I've seen, not as prominent of an issue as we saw in 2018, when that was a really, really distinguishing factor that branded Kemp to the right of in the primary and also in a contrast with Abrams in the general.
Good point. And then, the other gubernatorial election, obviously, that I think is particularly interesting when it comes to gun policy is New York. Now, this is another situation where, Lee Zeldin, the Republican there running against incumbent Kathy Hochul, his campaign messaging has not been primarily focused on guns, right? It's more crime and inflation and the economy. But it seems that Hochul has, of course, you have that's another state where they passed significant gun legislation before the election. Hochul got pushed through the response to the Supreme Court striking down the state's old gun carry law, and the response is now mired in court battles as well, and has been found unconstitutional by two separate federal judges there. And interestingly, Hochul is the one who seems to be pivoting towards guns at the end of this race as polls have tightened as a sort of response to the crime accusations from Zeldin, which is something that you've seen the gun control groups advocate for, connecting those two issues. But she seems to be the only really prominent candidate in a tight election that's actually doing that. And it doesn't seem to be helping to this point, at least in the polling. What's your take on that race?
Well, a few important points in New York. Number one, New York is a state that if you polled the voters, if you had a referendum on gun control, it would pass overwhelmingly. It's a blue state, needless to say. It's a state where, what you're seeing Governor Hochul do is trying to make the crime issue about gun control. I don't think it's working. I think people realize that, and we saw this debate, the big debate that the two candidates had in the past few weeks, where the governor was trying to make it out to be a gun control issue. And Lee Zeldin was saying, look, it's not just guns. People are getting pushed in front of subway trains in New York City. People are getting assaulted, and the Jews are getting assaulted on the streets of Crown Heights. This is not just the rise in crime, the rise in violent crime even is not just a gun issue. And she didn't have a particularly compelling response to that. So that's an interesting little sidebar to the whole gun debate, because the number one issue in a lot of these New York governor's race polls is crime. And I think you said Hochul is and I haven't followed every race super close, like to that granular effect, but you said like Hochul was the only Democrat who's trying to make the crime issue about gun control. I've heard the Biden White House kind of trying to do that recently.
Sure.
Where they're trying to, they know they have a big disadvantage in the polling when it comes to crime, but they think they have an advantage when it comes to gun policy in certain areas, especially certainly New York, they do. So what you're seeing is they're trying to change the subject. The problem, as I said, with Hochul's strategy is that, I think a lot of voters, even, non-Republican voters, swing voters, Democratic voters who are feeling the pinch of crime, they don't see this as a gun issue. I think they see this as a New York City is out of control issue, that you can't walk in the streets without the fear of being mugged issue. And there's a little bit of tone deafness coming from the Governor Hochul, about the crime problem. I think they agree with her on guns and gun control, but that's not the issue at hand. And she is sort of, in recent weeks, almost denied that there is a crime problem, to the point where that's become a major issue, than a more important issue, a more important focus than the candidates' positions on gun control.
Right. Yeah. She had that remark about, wondering why Zeldin cares so much about the crime issue during the debate, which was not a shining moment for her, I don't think. But yeah, certainly this is the strategy that she's employing, that every town has advocated for publicly, right? They put out a bunch of polling that they say where they're making the case that Democrats should try to connect these issues. The White House has done it to some extent, but I haven't really seen it as a actual focal point of a campaign in a lot of places. And certainly you could argue that's not the focal point for Hochul or Hochul. Sorry if I mispronounced her name earlier, but certainly it's something that she's definitely attempted to pivot to, and that was clear in the debate and in her social media messaging during the debate, that she wants the crime issue to be seen as a gun issue. But yeah, it is an interesting point whether or not that's actually working, and certainly the polling indicates that he's closing on her still, and that would be a huge upset, right?
Huge upset. That would be the upset, the shocker. We're talking about it, so it's not totally off the radar from the press, from the media. But for a state that voted for Democrats by over 20 points to be competitive in the governor's race, with, like you said, Stephen, Lee Zeldin is not exactly like your Rockefeller moderate Republican. He's a pro-Trump Republican who, didn't vote to confirm the election results in Pennsylvania and Arizona. He comes across as a very mild, very he has a good manner about him. He can appeal to these suburban voters because he doesn't look like Jim Jordan or Marjorie Taylor Greene or some of the more right-wing lawmakers. But in terms of his voting record and his position vis-a-vis Trump, he is not a moderate Republican. He's not an anti-Trump Republican. So the fact that I think a lot of folks assume that because of his ties to Trump, he would be unelectable in a state like New York. And as it's turning out, Governor Hochul's disconnect from the biggest issues facing New York voters, crime number one, is causing her to lose the political altitude that the Democratic Party typically has.
Yeah, and Zeldin hasn't run away from the gun issue necessarily. He's been on record as criticizing her decision to pass the new gun carry law, and they do have a contrast in their stated positions. He's just not really trying to make it an issue. It's more what she's trying to do. I think there's another important point here about perception, right? Perception is what's going to really rule the day in politics, right? If Hochul wins, but she only wins by a couple points, when it comes to this late strategy of trying to shift towards gun control, that'll probably be viewed as a loser, right? Well,
look, it's kind of like the debate over what's the most abortion versus the economy, right? Mm-hmm. If you look at the polling, more Americans now identify as pro-choice, and there's a pretty clear majority of voters across the country in swing states supporting abortion rights, right? But when you actually ask voters what's a more important issue, the economy, inflation, or abortion, the economy wins by a landslide. So, there are cross currents in our politics. And like I was saying before, most New Yorkers probably are well to your left, and they're well to the left across the country when it comes to gun control, right? But It doesn't mean it doesn't mean if you have a choice between trying to put more police on the streets, trying to change New York's bail law, which Lee Zeldin, New York passed the bail law in 2019 that made it easier for criminals to get out of, to not serve time and to recommit offenses on the streets of New York. And if you ask them, is that a bigger problem for your average New York voter, or is the gun policy in New York a bigger problem? Well, I think you're seeing that Zeldin's focus on the bail law is a much bigger concern, a much bigger a much bigger problem for Democrats. I mean, New York, by the way, as you noted, Stephen, New York has pretty strict gun control laws as is. So it's kind of like, if you're in a blue state where abortion rights are already protected, you may not be as worried about, what a Republican would do to abortion laws in the state. Same thing with gun control. Like, Democrats are controlling the legislature. There's not public support for change, for loosening gun laws, and there's not the votes for that in Albany. So, I think people realize that gun policy is not going to change, or some people would realize that gun control is not going to be an issue that's going to change if you elect a Republican to the governorship.
Perhaps, right. And I agree that generally speaking, all of these races will probably be viewed as coming down to, or pretty much every race in this election is not going to be viewed as coming down to gun policy as the top issue, because it's just it's certainly not the top issue, it seems, in any race. Even, Beto O'Rourke and Abbott, that's not the main thing, but it's not perhaps the number one issue, especially if you look at the polling. But these are the races where the issue is more prominent, in my view at least, than in most other races around the country, including a lot of the battleground Senate races and some of the other more competitive House races or other gubernatorial elections. And so that's why I feel there'll be a lot of things to draw when it comes down to it. At the end of the day, a lot of conclusions to draw from how these elections turn out. But one of the conclusions, I feel like, in these three races in particular, maybe Texas and New York more so than Georgia. I don't. I'm interested in your thought on this. One of the conclusions will be how gun policy performed. If, for instance, if Lee Zeldin outperforms expectations, Hochul's turn towards gun control in the closing, weeks of the race will probably be viewed negatively as strategy going forward. And then if Beto outperforms the polls, maybe the opposite conclusion gets drawn there. Do you think that's a realistic way of looking at the conclusions people are going to draw from these races when they're done?
So I think the biggest takeaway is that if Republicans take back the House and win a big, healthy majority in the Senate, if they win seats, perhaps like in Arizona and New Hampshire, by the way, two states that have very libertarian voting bases and have a very strong base of gun rights supporters in both those states. If you see a big wave, like gun rights, that's going to be a mandate for the new Republican Congress to protect gun rights. You're not going to see any gun control measures pass through Congress or get proposed.
Sure.
I think it's more important to look at the macro, because ultimately the parties have such diametrically opposed views on gun rights these days that even if you have a couple moderate Dems that are part of the coalition, it's really which party controls Washington and sets the policy agenda. That's going to be the biggest determinant for gun policy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to talk about general control of Congress, but I do want, do you see any races in particular that are going to tell us anything about gun policy? Like, am I reaching too much when I say Texas and New York are going to
you brought up some really good
something
races
about gun policy? Or
yeah, I mean, like I said, New York, I don't think the gun rights themselves are really going to shift based on who's elected governor, or at the very least, they're maybe Hochul would pass more restrictive gun measures and Zeldin wouldn't, but I don't think you're going to see a rollback even with a Republican in New York. But I just mentioned Arizona and New Hampshire, and again, sometimes it's not what sometimes the issue of gun policy is the background. Is the background noise in a race. I mean, Arizona has a lot. Gun policy has been a big issue in Arizona in recent years, and it's a big part of the Blake Masters coalition in the Senate race,
Right.
the Kerry Lake coalition for governor. So maybe it's, again, like in Georgia, it's not front and center. It may not be the number one issue on the airwaves, but you better believe that that's going to be seen as a bellwether for where, how strong a coalition the gun rights supporters in the state of Arizona are. And New Hampshire is another state where live free or die, right? It's always been a pretty strong Second Amendment state, maybe a little less so lately, but New Hampshire's always had that libertarian tradition, gun protecting tradition. And it's a state that Democrats have felt pretty good about because of the weaknesses of the Republican challenger, Don Bolduc. But look, if Republicans win in New Hampshire, there are a lot of gun voters that are probably showing up to the polls and backing the Republican and being part of this potential Republican wave. So, I think those two races, they're at the edge of the Senate map right now. It's Arizona and New Hampshire, but boy, those are races that could show the potency of the gun rights, the gun rights element of the Republican coalition.
Okay, interesting. So there's two other ones people should watch for. But going back to your point about the macro level results here, right? We've got control of Congress is up for grabs. Things seem to be trending towards the Republicans in the closing days here, but I want to talk about the two, ways that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party have approached this election when it comes to gun policy, because my thought, at least, is that Republicans, especially in the Senate, especially Mitch McConnell, signed on to the bipartisan gun bill earlier this year, in part because they wanted to take this issue off of the top of mind for a lot of suburban voters. I mean, Mitch McConnell was out there basically saying exactly that to Politico at the time. And then on the other side, House Democrats, they passed an AR-15 ban, a so-called assault weapons ban, through the House for the first time since the original one in '94 passed. And so they seem to want this issue on the top of mind, at least for some voters, perhaps voters in those blue seats that are aren't typical. It's sort of second level blue seats that are in danger, right? It might hurt the ones in the, who are in the battleground districts, but they're probably going to lose anyway. So we're going to do this to try and give another issue to that second line Democrat representatives. And I don't know, I'm interested in, one, if you think that is how those strategies were meant to play out, or if I'm off base there, and two, if whose strategy is working.
So your reference to the gun control bill, which was sort of a mental health gun regulation, bipartisan bit of legislation post Uvalde. Look, I think it showed the continuing influence of the gun rights lobby. I mean, it was the fact that was. I saw it more as a mental health funding bill. I mean, I think Democrats needed to kind of. I mean, there was some red flag provisions in there that Democrats had promoted, but to me, it was the Republicans were given a fig leaf to kind of pass something. I think you nailed the politics pretty well. That Mitch McConnell in particular, wanted to make sure the party was branded a little more favorably in the suburbs and especially the immediate aftermath of Uvalde. There was a real worry that Republicans would just be seen as hardline objectors to anything trying to deal with, what they see as the kind of what Democrats certainly see as the kind of rash of mass murders involving guns, right? Mm-hmm. So, I think it's an incremental piece of legislation. It wasn't just a gun bill; it was a mental health funding legislation, which helped get some other Republicans on board. But yeah, I certainly in the Senate, McConnell viewed the politics of trying to do something on the gun side of things as positive politically. Though in the House, like you note, it's a lot trickier because there are a lot of safely Republican seats, or even rural swing seats like in Maine, or there are a lot of districts in New Mexico. There are districts on the map that are competitive. That if you come out against the NRA, if you come out against gun rights, you're going to be in trouble as a Democrat. So it's a tricky, the Republican or the gun rights position has held the upper hand for quite some time in American politics because their voters are folks that show up, that are engaged. As they're engaged, they show up, they're organized, And that makes a difference, not just in red parts of the country, but in areas where there is a pretty sizable rate of gun ownership.
Do you think that that bill succeeded in sort of bringing this issue off top of mind for those suburban voters they're targeting? Because, yeah, I mean, obviously you have the committed voters on either side. And it certainly does seem like the gun rights side has, an advantage in that area of gun owners coming out to vote over gun control supporters as like their top issue. But it seemed like that bill, as you mentioned, is really it's a compromise bill. It has a few new restrictions, things like closing the so-called boyfriend loophole. There's a couple things in there. There's a more comprehensive, it's almost a de facto waiting period for 18 to 20-year-olds when they go to buy a gun, or at least more flexibility for the FBI to take longer in doing their background checks for that age group. There's stuff like that in the bill, but at the same time, it's certainly not anything that either side was extremely excited about. But I think the goal was to try and move this from a 8-9 point, in your most important issue poll down to, to one or 2 point where it usually hangs out as far as gun policy goes. And it seems like that's what's happened, whereas it seemed to me like passing the assault weapons ban was a way to try and get guns back into. It was like, look, yeah, we did this bipartisan bill, but it's not enough. That was the consistent messaging that you heard from the White House and House Democrats. Wasn't enough. We need to do more. We got this bill through. We just need your help to, hold your ground, give us, another go at getting it through Congress. Keep this issue at the top of your head. But it seems like Republicans got the better of that strategy at least when it comes to, your less committed types as far as gun policy goes.
Well, look, I think your political analysis is really good. It was a box checking exercise, like we just discussed. I think at least on the Senate side, McConnell viewed it as a way to show a little more outreach to the suburban voters that are so important in a lot of these swing state races. And look, it takes it off the table. There was an outcry for Congress to do something. You hear this a lot in the aftermath of these awful mass shootings in schools.
Right.
It was all just gut wrenching, and that was what kind of necessitated something to be done. And I think Republicans are relieved. They're playing a little defense politically, relieved to have it off the table so they can talk about other issues that are more salient to the swing voters that make up the critical mass of these swing state, or that make the difference in these swing state elections.
Right, absolutely. Like I don't think it was designed to get gun voters out to the polls. I think it was designed to take the issue down from to your third or fourth or fifth most important issue to a suburban voter who's not generally voting on guns anyway. And it seems like that's worked, but obviously we'll have to wait to see for the election how that turns out. Speaking of which, the gun groups, both sides, they make lots of endorsements in these races, right? But as you mentioned earlier, guns have really become a very polarized issue. And so a lot of their endorsements are just the NRA endorses Republicans, and Everytown, Giffords, and other groups endorse Democrats. So how much insight can we gain from looking at how they did in their respective races as far as endorsements go?
Well, look, as we said at the outset, these days the gun endorsements are pretty partisan affairs. It's not so much the groups; it's also the sorting out of the different coalitions. The Republicans are now a pro-gun party; the Democrats are a gun control supporting party. So, a lot of the scorecards are going to basically reflect, which party does better on election night. It's not. I don't know if it really tells you a whole lot about the clout of the organizations themselves. The NRA is certainly not nearly as influential as it was, a decade ago, 20 years ago, because of a lot of scandals and controversies in its organization. So, they'll claim victories, and certainly this is going to be looking like a very good night for Republicans taking back, if they take back, the House and potentially the Senate. But I don't know. Every group is going to try to claim that they did something to get that result. I think it's more, as we've been discussing in this podcast, there are a lot of other issues that have moved voters towards the Republican Party this year, and gun gun control groups, or sorry, gun owner and the NRA and other gun rights groups are benefiting from that Republican wave, benefiting from that movement writ large to the Republican Party.
And a lot of these, gun group endorsements now, you can also up your average by just not endorsing in certain races, right? And so that kind of takes a little bit away from the relevance of all these endorsements as far as like trying to parse out how well each gun group did in their respective races, right? Or am I reading too much into
No,
that?
I think that's right. And again, it's hard to look. I mean, I care about where you spend money. If the Chamber of Commerce makes a lot of endorsements, but they're not spending money for their candidates, like it's just a list. It's a piece of paper. I care. The NRA used to be a little. I mean, look, the power of the NRA is in its membership. Like the people,
right.
Are there a lot of, as you know, this is a litmus test issue for a whole lot of voters, and they're overwhelmingly Republican now. So you don't need a group to mobilize gun rights voters, right? I mean, and the NRA was very effective in its heyday. They don't have quite as much clout as they used to, but you don't need a group. You don't need an outside force to tell people how to vote on a lot of these issues. They know it through their they know that the Republican Party now is pretty much the party aligned with gun rights ownership.
Yeah, although certainly I think that's another area you could look at is how well they mobilize voters through their internal, get out the vote mechanisms on either side. It will probably have an impact, although that'll be harder to read, right, than simply looking at where they're spending, ad dollars in campaigns. That'll be more important than the endorsements, but and you can actually see there's a smaller number of races. I mean, for instance, the NRA has spent the majority of their money in just 6 Senate races. The 6 big ones, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, Georgia, and Pennsylvania. And then there's one other one that's off the top of my mind, but they're putting most of their resources in those races. You're seeing matches from the gun control side in those races as well. But you're also seeing a little more diversity on the gun control side. And they're sort of trying to protect some of their House Democrats that are big supporters of theirs who've come up through their system of developing candidates like Lucy McBeth in Georgia. And there's also the state Senate race in Colorado that's every town has poured a bunch of money into to try and keep control of the state Senate there. It's one of the few states where you've seen significant growth or significant movement in gun laws over the last 10 years, in the direction of the gun control movement. So, those seem like races to really watch as well, right?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. And every town is obviously the big spender on the Democratic side for gun control support. And they're not quite as active as they've been in other elections, certainly not in the presidential in 2020, but they're still playing. They're still spending big money in some handful of key races, and that is those are the battle lines in this election.
Yeah, so I think that gives people a pretty good guide, a pretty good base for where they should actually look on Tuesday when the election results start rolling in and we start to see who's winning and who's losing, where, who's getting upset and what's coming in, what the way we expected. If you're trying to figure out how gun politics are working out and where things are headed, I think we've laid out a pretty good little guide here for that, right?
Yeah.
Is there anything else?
Thanks for having me, Stephen. I enjoyed talking about all these big races and the impact of the gun issue on our politics, and look forward to being back on the show.
Yeah, I think you had some really good insights there. Is there any other big thing you would point to as far as gun politics on Tuesday?
Yeah, like I said, I think you're going to have a lot of happy folks at the NRA if Republicans do take control of the Senate and the House. So I think the big picture in this election, where we do have control of the both chambers at play, that is going to be what the NRA and a lot of gun rights supporters are going to be watching.
Yeah, so that the big picture will be really important in the end here. Now, can you tell people just a little bit more about where they can find your writing, where they can find your work?
Yeah, you can go to Axios.com, subscribe to the sneak peek newsletter. I have the Sunday edition, as I said before, covering campaigns and elections. I'll also be, if you are tuning in on election night, if you go to Fox News, I will be being one of the many analysts breaking down the results, breaking down what we're seeing live on the network. So tune into Fox if you're interested in seeing me and seeing more analysis about gun politics and everything else under the sun for the 2022 midterms.
Or you could tune into CNN and watch me. Either way.
That's right. Congratulations, by the way.
Yes.
Big. I think that that's a great honor that you're getting to talk about gun policy and gun politics on CNN.
Well, I really appreciate it, and I absolutely love your work, and we'll continue to follow it at Axios and on Fox as well. So appreciate you joining the show. We'll have to have you on again in the future to try and suss out how these elections turned out and what we should think going forward. So appreciate it, and we'll have you on again shortly.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate it.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for another weekly news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogelman, joined as always by Reload founder Steve Gutowski. How are you this week, Steve?
I'm doing pretty great, Jake. We are filming this on Wednesday because I'm going to go up to Philadelphia and try and watch at least one of these World Series games. I don't think I have the money to watch more than one of those in person. I don't know if I have the money to watch any of them in person, but we'll find out once I get up there. There's this theory that the ticket prices were going to come down on game day, and that has not panned out at all. So I don't know. We'll see. Either way, very happy. Phillies won last night, so can't ask for much more than that at this point. Phillies, the Flyers are doing well. The Sixers are picking things back up, and the Eagles are undefeated. So I don't know. I don't know what else you could possibly want from for a Philly fan at this point in time.
It's rough to be so happy for you from a distance because Denver sports are pretty pitiful right now. So
yeah. I don't know what happened with Russ Wilson out there. That's seems like you got him right as his career decided to implode.
Yeah, things aren't really panning out there.
No.
But speaking of, aside from World Series season, we also have election season coming up.
Yes.
The race is less than a week away as we're recording. And in one of the higher profile gubernatorial races, we actually have a new poll showing things aren't going so well for one of the challengers looking to unseat an incumbent governor. If you want to tell us about this new poll that you wrote up.
Yeah, this is one of those key races that we're following, right? As far as gun policy goes, there, we've talked a little bit about how people generally have stopped paying close attention to gun politics as we head into the election season here, as the election actually draws nearer. But there are a few races where it's likely to be a deciding factor, or at least one of the big deciding factors. And the Texas gubernatorial election is absolutely one of those races because you have, on the one hand, an incumbent Republican governor who has signed a bunch of pro-gun reforms, including permitless concealed carry in the state this year. Or just recently, I forget if it was this year or last year, but either way, very pro-gun in terms of his record, who has essentially stood by that and refused to institute new gun restrictions even after Uvalde happened, which was one of the worst mass shootings in the country's history. Of course, that itself is making the issue bigger in Texas than in a lot of other races. And then on the other side of the coin, you also have Beto O'Rourke, who's the Democratic nominee and is very well known for his call to confiscate AR-15s and AK-47s. He famously said, "Hell yes, we want to take your AR-15s and AK-47s." So there's no real nuance on this issue. Beto has, of course, flip-flopped a little bit on that, but his current position is still that he doesn't believe anyone should be allowed to own those firearms. They're obviously very popular. There's 24.4 million AR-15s and AK-47s and similar guns in the country, according to the National Shooting Sports Foundation. So this is a very stark contrast in this race. And, we've been following it since the beginning. And now the latest poll from University of Houston shows Abbott with his biggest lead of the entire elections. It's the largest lead that he has held since they've been polling this race at 13 points. And it's actually an increase in his lead by 3 points over the last time University of Houston released a poll. And now the Real Clear Politics average of polls has Abbott with a lead of 9.2%. So that also is right up there with his largest leads of the entire race. So as things close, the gap is actually widening.
Yeah, it's definitely not what you're looking for if you're hoping to unseat an incumbent is this close to election day, having the momentum going the opposite direction. It certainly makes it a little bit tougher it was always sort of a long shot because, Texas, for all the talk about it possibly being blue every year, it's still a red state. You're still talking about an incumbent governor. So it was always going to be a tough uphill battle. But certainly this is not something that Beto O'Rourke wants to see heading this close to the election, particularly as he's running a pretty aggressive campaign, as you pointed out, especially on guns.
Yeah, and he stuck with that message even into the very closing days of the race here. His last ad talks about Uvalde and Abbott's failures there, and he's still pushing that in his stump speeches and his social media messaging. The gun component is a big part of his campaign. There's no denying that, I think. You're not necessarily seeing that in a lot of other races. There are a few other ones, of course, which we've covered and will continue to talk about as we get closer to election day. But this is certainly one of those key races, one of those bellwether races for gun policy in the United States. If Beto not only doesn't win, but gets blown out, that's going to have repercussions, I think, moving forward for Democrats on this issue all over the country.
Yeah, you would think at least rhetorically, because as you said, he was pretty hardline about his approach, because I don't think we'll see them do a complete 180 on their approach to guns, but certainly I would think they would soften their approach to the issue going forward.
Right. And certainly you'll likely see a lot of arguments that rely on the idea that this election was not about guns nationally, so we can't draw too much from. I'm sure that would be the message from a lot of gun control advocates if Beto does get blown out, if Republicans have a lot of success in this election generally. But I think the reality will still be there that, this star of the Democratic Party keeps losing these races. And one of the big things he runs on is gun confiscation. So I don't think that's going to go unnoticed in practical terms by a lot of political actors moving forward, if that's how it turns out. Now, if Beto pulls off a win somehow, or he makes it a lot closer than people expected, that, a lot of politics is a perception game. So even if he loses by 5 points or 4 points, that's going to be a huge swing from what the perception is right now, given the polling numbers. And so, that could soften the blow of him losing on as far as the takeaway for gun policy. But if he gets blown out, I think that's going to say a lot. And so that's a race that's important to watch and a key one. We also have a couple other key races that we can take from your latest reporting from the spending that's going on. And one way is you can tell which races are actually important to these gun groups is where they're spending their money, right? So you have a new update. We've got some new spending this week from one of the big gun groups. Which one was it and where were they spending?
Yeah, so we've been covering for a few weeks now the two big gun groups on either side, the NRA and Everytown, have been fairly active, particularly in the big swing Senate races. But we haven't seen a ton from some of the other groups. But just this week, the PAC for Brady, which is, as you said, one of the big gun control groups, has started to invest in two House races in particular, these two incumbent Democrats. One is Representative Stephen Horsford in Nevada, and the other is Representative Lucy McBath in Georgia. They started just pouring about tens of thousands of dollars. I think there's about $40,000 for Horsford thus far and about $20,000 for McBath, just over two separate investments in ad spending. But basically just trying to boost them as we get 1 week away from the election. It's interesting to see where they're putting their money there. At least McBath makes a little more sense. She kind of came on the scene as a gun control candidate. She was a longtime Moms Demand Action volunteer who was motivated to run for Congress in 2018 and unseated an incumbent Republican pretty much on a gun control message. It was a wave year for Democrats, obviously, but gun control was one of her big issues. The other candidate, Horsford, is not so much known for his gun control advocacy. He's more of a big on community violence interruption programs, some of the less controversial measures that you typically see in this space. But definitely interesting to see that those are the two candidates that they're choosing to invest their money in.
Yeah, it certainly gives you some insight into how the House races are going. So, Macbeth is not much of a surprise, right? They want to protect their own. They want to protect the people that they have formed close relationships with. And she's one of their sort of star legislators on the gun control side. And so it's not surprising that they'd want to make sure that she's going to win her race. I wouldn't be surprised if other gun control groups have, invested in that race as well, especially Everytown. Obviously, she was a Moms Demand Action, which is part of Everytown, volunteer at one point. So, if those races are in play, I think it says a lot about where things are moving in this election as far as the likelihood that Republicans pick up a number of seats here on next Tuesday. But that's something we're going to continue to follow as well, is where these groups are spending as we get closer, because the gun control groups really don't have a lot of money left right now. We talked about this on last week's episode with Open Secrets, and they don't have much left in the bank at this point, whereas the NRA has a lot of money. They've got like $9 million left to spend if they want to. It's not clear how much of that they're going to spend, but we haven't, you checked the FEC records this morning, and there wasn't any new spending from the NRA as of Wednesday, the 2nd of November here. And so that's, so you wonder if how much they're really going to be able to spend in the last 6 days.
Right. And how much it even matters, because so many states have early voting now that a lot of people have already cast their votes. So there's not a ton left that you can do to sway. So,
yeah. So, if the NRA doesn't drop that money in these elections, obviously they can hold it for the next election. And maybe that's what they're part of their strategy. Like, they see where things are going for this election. They don't want to burn up all their resources.
Yeah.
And so the gun control groups might have the opposite view of things because they're trying to protect seats. And so we'll have to wait and see. It might be that the gun control groups outspend the NRA, even though the NRA has outraised them to this point. But that's what we're going to keep on top of. We're going to keep watching. The NRA has a history of coming in late to races in the recent cycles. So it could very well be that they'll drop another couple million before next Tuesday. But you're right. You do start to wonder about the relevance of spending that kind of money this late. But that's something we're going to keep on top of, and we're going to keep on top of all these races and let you know which ones to look at for how to determine the way that gun policy played out in this election. And we're going to do all that over at The Reload, where you can pick up a membership today if you want to get exclusive access to hundreds of pieces that you will not find anywhere else on the internet or in the world. And you should go over and check out our membership options today. If you like this show, if you want to help us grow, you want to help get the message out to more people, get our reporting out to more people, you can do that by liking, sharing, rating this episode, letting people know about it. We always appreciate that sort of support as well. It really helps our efforts to grow as a publication. And but until next week, that's all we've got for you.